My story of the week, what prohibition costs. A spate of new national polls show Rick Santorum leading Mitt Romney nationally, and state polls in Michigan, which is set to vote in little over a week from now, show Santorum leading Romney there too. Santorum has appeared to capture the severely anti-Romney sentiment of the GOP's base, which if you take a step back is a fantastically ironic situation. We all knew the base was suspicious of the so-called Massachusetts moderate who signed into law a universal health care bill, but after 2 years of Tea Party rhetoric, live free or die, and Gadsden flag signs, what we're seeing now is the base of the GOP rallying around a candidate with powerful authoritarian impulses. A man who thinks states should be able to outlaw birth control, a man who explicitly views his own worldview as a rebuke or antidote to libertarianism.
I am not a libertarian, and I fight very strongly against libertarian influence within the Republican Party and the conservative movement. I don't think the libertarians have it right when it comes to what the Constitution's all about. I don't think they have it right as to how what our history is. And we are not a group of people that believes in no government.
We're seeing something similar across the country as Republicans and conservatives from Virginia to Texas attempt to marshal the state to regulate private behavior, including a bill that will require many women to have a transvaginal ultrasound, in other words, forcible penetration for no medical reason, when seeking an abortion in Virginia. The bill has passed both the state Senate and House and is expected to be signed by Virginia's Republican Governor Bob McDonnell. All this lays bare something obvious but so often ignored. The central axis of our politics is not about the size and role of government. It just isn't. Sure, there are a tiny number of folks around Reason magazine who are fully consistent in their view of the exercise of state power, but for most of us, our politics are driven by what kind of world we want to see. Our moral commitments, our cultural affiliations, our upbringing and personality type. There are all kinds of places where the left wants less government, a smaller military, a smaller deportation bureaucracy, fewer prisons, and a less onerous intellectual property regime for pharmaceuticals, and conservatives want more government, larger border controls, more checks on whether women can get abortions, bigger armies, and more private prisons. The intervention of the state is a means to an end, and politics is about those ends. American dominance or American cooperation with the world, law and order, or treatment and rehabilitation. How and why the state could productively intervene in pursuing our ends is often a question of efficacy, of costs and benefits. Most importantly, who a policy costs and who it benefits. And there is no single piece of domestic policy whose costs seem more obscure to those in power than the war our government has declared on our fellow citizens who use drugs. Here's none other than Rick Santorum in New Hampshire just last month being asked a question by Students for Sensible Drug Policy.
Would you continue to distort families by sending non-violent drug offenders to prison?
Wow. Federal government doesn't do that.
Federal government doesn't do that, except, of course, it does. And in the 40 years since the infamous war on drugs began, the federal government has spent $121 billion to arrest more than 37 million nonviolent drug offenders, about 10 million of them for possession of marijuana. Just because no one in Rick Santorum's direct social circle has ever been on the wrong side of the drug war's artillery doesn't mean there aren't civilian casualties. The war is monumentally expensive, cruel failure, a slow-motion disaster that chews through our fellow citizens and spits them out. About half of federal inmates in 2010 were serving time for drug offenses, according to the U.S. Justice Department, and studies show that jail time tends to increase drug abuse. Along with immigration, drug policy seems to marshal our most authoritarian impulses. Can you imagine us declaring a war on speeding, or heaven forfend, a war on tax evasion? Absurd, of course, but when it comes to drugs, no amount of enforcement and regulation is too high, no imposition too great to bear. None other than Santorum himself voted as senator to increase federal penalties for cocaine and methamphetamine offenses. And I should be very clear, this is largely a bipartisan consensus. While pledging on the campaign trail to take a new approach to the war on drugs and initially pursuing that, Barack Obama has largely continued the trajectory. What's most remarkable is that, unlike so many of our social problems, the solution is fairly obvious and straightforward. Decriminalize drugs. Portugal did it in 2001, and 10 years later, drug abuse was down by half. And we don't even have to look overseas for precedent. We have lived through this before. We tried prohibition of the nation's most popular drug, alcohol, for almost 14 years, and it was, by near consensus, one of the single greatest legal failures in the history of the republic. people found ways to get around the law. Drugstores became virtual liquor stores because they were allowed to dispense medicinal alcohol. In the 1920s, a drugstore, still around today, Walgreens, grew from a chain of just 20 stores to 525. Historian Michael Lerner notes, the growth of the illegal liquor trade under Prohibition made criminals of millions of Americans. As the decade progressed, courtrooms and jails overflowed and the legal system failed to keep up. Sounds familiar. The greatest unintended consequence of Prohibition, however, was the plainest to see. The solution the United States had devised to address the problem of alcohol abuse had instead made the problem even worse. Years from now, we will look back and view our own era in the same way. Live free or die, indeed. I want to bring in Peter Moskos, author of a fantastic book that I read about a year ago. It's stuck with me ever since. It's called Cop in the Hood, former Baltimore City police officer, now a professor at John Jay College. Peter, it's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me on.
So I think we sort of set up this idea of enforcement and what we enforce and how we choose to enforce what we enforce and what can be eradicated through enforcement and what cannot be. And I want you to talk a bit about what your experience on the front lines was of the plausibility or possibility of enforcement as a means of actually coming to some point in which we have declared victory or won the war on drugs.
It's simply not going to happen. And then everyone involved in this knows we can't win. We can sort of maintain a violent status quo that involves lots of incarceration, but it doesn't reduce the violence. Just in the last 16 hours where I used to police in the Eastern District, I just heard there were 3 shootings and a double stabbing. You're probably not going to hear about that except for me. It's probably not even going to make the papers. Right. This just goes on day after day in very isolated, very poor, very deprived communities, and they're deprived partly because of the war on drugs. We have to understand there are drug problems, but that's separate from prohibition problems. We can solve the prohibition problem.
Yeah, how separable are those two? Because I think when we were debating a little bit about where the audience that's watching this right now is going to be on this issue, right? Like, how much if you're watching at home, are you with us on, yes, decriminalize drugs, and how much are folks, I don't know about that, how that sounds. And I think one of the reasons, if you're on the fence or it sounds terrifying to you, the notion that, suddenly overnight we would decriminalize drugs, is the idea that prohibition problems and drug problems can't be separated. So what are prohibition problems and what are drug problems?
The prohibition problems, and that, as a former police officer, or what I'm more interested, the prohibition problems involve the distribution of drugs. I don't know what the answer is for heroin addiction. It's a horrible problem. No one's got a perfect solution. But we do have a solution to young people shooting each other on the corner. This is about trade. The point of getting soft on drugs is not to have a drug free-for-all. That's what we have now. The point is to regulate and control the drugs and to regulate and control the trade, just the way that the state took over from Al Capone, basically, when we ended alcohol prohibition in 1933. That should be a model.
I know, but you know that right when you hear, when anybody hears you saying the state is going to be regulating, and you're like, so now the state is going to be regulating what, marijuana? The state is going to be regulating cocaine? I'm sure that a lot of viewers out there are just saying, then they also are like, oh God, how do I even conceive that? And a distrust of the state as well, that immediately comes in and says,
well, no matter what people think about the state, I hope they distrust criminals more. I mean, that's who's doing it now. Is the system perfect? No, it's not perfect with alcohol or tobacco, but it works pretty well. I mean, we've accepted that there are still alcohol problems, but the states and cities can control how alcohol is sold and to whom it's sold. This is control we don't now have over drug use.
Right. Just with regard to your essay earlier on, I just wanted to note that Chris Christie, the governor of New Jersey, has called for no longer sending nonviolent drug offenders to prison. The Prison Rape Elimination Act was really championed by a lot of conservatives, particularly conservative evangelicals. In states like Texas, it's many Republicans who've been leading the charge to reform the prison system. And fortunately, you have some folks in New York who, under the previous governor, reformed the Rockefeller drug laws. I think that there is some modest progress, but I do think that when you're looking at the politics of the prison issue, unfortunately, it's not Democrats on one side and Republicans on another side. I think that it's a lot of people that had anxiety about being accused of being soft on crime who are all very fearful. And fortunately, you have some people who on moral grounds are saying this is an outrage. And as Chris Christie said in a State of the State address, we're actually wasting a huge amount of human potential with these policies.
It's also, I mean, this is a really, we have to look at this in the minute level, right? Like, so first off, we're calling it a war on drugs. It's actually not. Right. It's a war in black neighborhoods. The vast majority of these nonviolent criminals are people who have been arrested for marijuana possession. They're not drug dealers. They are black men who have been arrested for possession of marijuana. And the war is a policing tool in neighborhoods like mine in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, that yes are deprived in some ways, but also just are a place where police are looking for as much power as they can get to harass people on the street, and everything from the cop level on up to the prosecutor. What it really is about is empowering police.
I think Peter can speak to why that's
a little cynical.
Wait, I want you to respond to that because you were a police officer, but I want to take a break first, and then we're going to come back to you on
All
that.
right.
All right.
This drug thing, this ain't police work. No, it ain't. I mean, I can send any fool with a badge and a gun up on them corners and jack a crew and grab vials. But policing, I mean, you call something a war. And pretty soon, everybody gonna be running around acting like warriors. They gonna be running around on a damn crusade, storming corners, slapping on cuffs, racking up body counts. And when you at war, you need a enemy. And pretty soon, damn near everybody on every corner is your enemy. And soon the neighborhood that you're supposed to be policing, that's just occupied territory.
Amazing monologue from Bunny Colvin from The Wire.
It's a great show.
Amazing show, and probably the most notorious fictional experimentation with decriminalization in the history of American pop culture, the Amsterdam experiment that Bunny Colvin undertook in that season of The Wire, in which there's an area of Baltimore that they basically said they're not gonna do the bus on. Kai just said something provocative, I think, about the war on drugs and the way in which it devolves discretion and power down to officers on the streets, and that they just want more power. They want the ability to enforce and harass young black men in neighborhoods like Bed-Stuy, and you want to respond to that.
I mean, police do respond to where the violence is. That's why police are in certain neighborhoods, because that's where the public drug dealing is, that's where the violence associated with drug prohibition is. The question, the $64,000 question, is what do cops do once they're there? And it's not easy. It's not an easy job. But this is where you need the most experienced cops, the cops who know their neighborhoods, the cops who stay there, who can separate the criminals from the non-criminals. And this is a problem. If you just stick a bunch of inexperienced rookie cops to learn somewhere, they're going to make mistakes. And where are they making these mistakes?
If you add to that the question of numbers or quotas, then you have this whole problem with stop and frisk, right? Because every time you do a stop and frisk in one of these communities, you're able to actually categorize that into what you did in that day, and that
and
just
quotas,
means
I think it's an important piece when it looks at how this happens, right?
Because it's also about money and quotas.
There's been a lot of great reporting from in the New York media on discovering the quotas for the number of stops that you have to have in neighborhoods like Bed-Stuy and given precincts in Bushwick. And yes, there are places where, in fact, local leaders have said, "Give us more cops," but it marries up with this national money stream for the war on drugs. That if you can prosecute aggressively in your neighborhood, you can get all kinds of tools.
I would say that the war on drugs is not good for the police. And I think that the way to think about this is the level of anxiety, sort of the concerns with the ways in which it shifts your mission in terms of policing, sort of away from actually kind of containing and preventing violence. I think that the problem that we have over the last 30 years is, kind of with the rise of mass incarceration, we haven't been investing resources in deterrence. We've in fact been undermining deterrence. One thing you do when you incarcerate huge numbers of people is you undermine the stigma associated with being incarcerated. Exactly. And that actually is the most effective tool in order to prevent criminal activity. But I mean, I think that that's the way to think about this, in my view, is that help the police do their job as effectively and well as they can and as they want to do it.
So I did a piece in the early 1990s precisely about jail as a rite of passage. Early 1990s, and here we are, and it still is a celebrated thing.
I want to talk about this issue about how the war on drugs has changed policing and police, and how we can reconstitute a healthier relationship on that front right after we take this break.